After World War II, the Korean Peninsula became one of the most tense flashpoints of the Cold War. Before that, Korea had been a Japanese colony for 35 years, from 1910 to 1945. When Japan surrendered to the Allies, the big question was, who would control the land? In August 1945, under an agreement between the United States and the Soviet Union, the Korean Peninsula was temporarily divided along the 38th parallel. The Soviet-occupied North supported the communist movement and established the government of Kim Il-sung. The US-controlled South supported the government of Ri-Sung-man. Both sides claimed to be the sole legitimate government, leading to increasingly deep political conflicts. In 1948, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea was established in the North, while the South established the Republic of Korea. From then on, the 38th parallel was not only a geographical boundary, but also a symbol of ideological division. Tensions flared repeatedly during 1948-1949. Minor clashes occurred along the border, killing thousands. Both sides sought support from the great powers. Kim Il-sung repeatedly persuaded the Soviet Union and China to support his plan to unify Korea by force. Meanwhile, Ri-Sung-man worked to build up his army, receiving aid from the United States, with the goal of defending the South and, if possible, expanding his influence into the North. By early 1950, the international situation was ripe for a major conflict. The Soviet Union, under Stalin, wanted to expand its influence in East Asia. China, having just completed its revolution in 1949, had become an important ally of the communist bloc. The United States adopted a policy of containment, ready to intervene to prevent the spread of communism. On June 25, 1950, history turned a new page. The North Korean People's Army unexpectedly crossed the 38th parallel, opening one of the most fierce wars of the 20th century, the Korean War. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers, equipped with Soviet artillery and T-34 tanks, flooded into the South. Seoul fell after only 3 days. The whole world was shocked to witness a full-scale war breaking out right in the first tense period of the Cold War. This was not just a conflict between the two Koreas, but quickly became a global confrontation, with the direct participation of the United States, the United Nations, and later China. Was this war avoidable, or was it the inevitable consequence of the global ideological divide? On June 25, 1950, before sunrise, the Korean People's Army, KPA, launched a massive attack along the 38th parallel. Some 135,000 troops, organized into several main divisions, poured into the South. These were not ragtag forces, but a Soviet-trained army equipped with machine guns, artillery, and especially T-34 tanks, the kind of weapon that had given Nazi Germany nightmares in World War II. Meanwhile, the Republic of Korea Army, ROKA, was completely caught by surprise. It numbered only about 95,000 men, lacked tanks, heavy artillery, and had almost no air force. It was mainly equipped with rifles and some old World War II artillery. An unequal battle broke out immediately. Within hours, the South's defense line had been breached at several points. North Korean divisions advanced like a storm, closing in on key cities. In the capital, Seoul, the situation became chaotic. Evacuees crowded onto the Han River Bridge, while the army had yet to organize a counterattack. Just 3 days later, on June 28, 1950, Seoul fell. The North Korean army raised the victory flag over government buildings, and President Ri-Sung-man hurriedly retreated to Daejeon. This image shocked not only the Korean people, but also the world. Many feared this would be the prelude to a wider expansion of communism in East Asia, especially after China fell to Mao Zedong in 1949. The defeat in Seoul was only the beginning. The South Korean army continuously retreated south, barely able to stop the overwhelming power of the North. Every step the enemy took brought tragic scenes. Villages burned, civilians killed or captured. At Daejeon, a major battle broke out in mid-July 1950. The South Vietnamese army, along with some newly landed American units, tried to stop the advance. However, their forces were too thin, lacking heavy weapons, and unfamiliar with the battlefield, and were quickly overwhelmed. Daejeon fell to the north, and General William Dean, the American commander there, was taken prisoner. This was a heavy blow to American military prestige. By August 1950, the North Vietnamese army had pushed the South Vietnamese forces back to a small area around the city of Busan, located at the southeastern tip of the peninsula. The Busan defense perimeter became South Korea's last bastion. If Busan fell, the entire Korean peninsula would fall to North Korea. As soon as the war broke out, US President Harry Truman called an emergency meeting with his advisors. He determined that this was not just an internal conflict, but part of a global Soviet strategy to expand its influence. If the United States did not act, other countries in Asia would doubt Washington's security commitment, and communism would spread unchecked. On June 27, 1950, the United Nations Security Council, amid a Soviet boycott of China, passed a resolution calling on member states to support South Korea. This was a major turning point. For the first time in history, the United Nations had organized an international military coalition to counter an invasion. The United States played a key role, quickly mobilizing large forces to the peninsula. Within weeks, American divisions, along with troops from Britain, Canada, Australia, the Philippines, and many other countries, landed in Busan. They established the United Nations Command under General Douglas MacArthur, the legendary World War II general who commanded American forces in the Pacific. 4. Busan Perimeter, the battle for survival. In August and September 1950, the decisive battle revolved around the Busan Perimeter. This was an area of more than 230 kilometers, where the UN and South Korean forces concentrated all their forces, trying to withstand the fierce attacks of the North. For weeks, the KPA continuously organized attacks. They hoped to quickly break the defense line, forcing the UN to retreat. But this time, the situation was different. The US Air Force dominated the skies, constantly bombing North Korean transport convoys and supply depots. The US Navy completely controlled the sea, ensuring logistics for Busan. Despite the fierceness, the Busan perimeter remained resilient. South Korean and UN troops, facing a nowhere to retreat, fought with a desperate spirit. Every hill, every river became a bloody battle. Tens of thousands died in just a few weeks. However, while the North concentrated all its forces on Busan, General MacArthur quietly prepared a daring counterattack plan, one of the most famous amphibious operations of the 20th century. During this time, the international media closely followed every development. Major newspapers such as the New York Times, The Times, UK, or Pravda, USSR, all reported extensively. For Westerners, the Korean War became a clear demonstration of the anti-communist liberation war. On the contrary, in communist countries, the press praised the National Liberation War launched by the North. In particular, the North Korean people suffered heavy losses. Millions lost their homes. Hundreds of thousands had to migrate to the south. Stories of separated families and groups of refugees became haunting images. In the desperate situation in Busan, could the United Nations turn things around, or would Korea quickly be unified under the red flag? By the end of the summer of 1950, the situation on the Korean peninsula was almost hopeless for South Korea and the United Nations. The Korean People's Army, KPA, controlled more than 90% of the territory, with only a small corner remaining around the city of Busan. All supply routes were blocked, and only the US Navy, which controlled the sea, could hold the line of defense. In this situation, many American generals believed that the only viable solution was to hold Busan, turning it into a permanent base, waiting for an opportunity to counterattack. But General Douglas MacArthur, Commander-in-Chief of the United Nations forces, thought otherwise. He believed that mere defense was suicidal, and victory required a surprise attack powerful enough to cut off all of the North's logistics. MacArthur began to plan a deep-sea landing in the enemy's rear, an extremely daring strategy, as it required overcoming numerous risks of terrain, tides, and even skepticism from allies. MacArthur proposed Incheon, a small seaport west of Seoul, as the landing site. This decision was strongly opposed by many generals. Incheon had extremely high tides, ranging up to 9 meters, making it difficult for warships to navigate. The shipping channel was narrow, there were many reefs, and landing craft could easily run aground. The landing period was only a few hours each day. Moreover, Incheon was hundreds of kilometers from Busan, meaning the landing troops would have to be separated from the main defense line. Many staff officers called this a crazy plan. Even the US Joint Chiefs of Staff initially opposed it, but MacArthur was adamant. Landing where the enemy least expects it is the key to success. He argued that all the safer and easier landing sites were heavily defended by the North. Only Incheon, so difficult, received little attention, and once Incheon was captured, the UN could quickly advance to capture Seoul, cutting off the KPA's vital supply line. MacArthur finally convinced Washington. September 15, 1950 was chosen as the opening date. To maintain maximum secrecy, the plan was revealed only to a small group of officers. Meanwhile, the army conducted mock exercises in Japan. the US Navy assembled a huge fleet, 260 warships, 70,000 troops from the United States, South Korea, Britain, Canada, and many other countries. It was one of the largest amphibious operations since World War II. Meanwhile, in Busan, the United Nations continued to hold out, staging small counterattacks to keep the North focused on the South, never suspecting an attack from behind. On the night of September 14, 1950, the Yellow Sea was covered in fog. The US fleet moved silently towards Incheon. The soldiers on board were nervous, many whispering that this was a suicide mission. Meanwhile, in Busan, the North Korean army was still concentrating on breaking through the defense line, completely unaware that a storm of steel was about to explode behind them. At dawn on September 15, 1950, the US Navy began a fierce bombardment of North Korean defenses around Incheon. Aircraft from aircraft carriers swooped in, dropping bombs to clear the way. Then landing ships loaded with American and South Korean soldiers came ashore. Despite the high tide, the operation went almost perfectly. The North Korean defense force at Incheon numbered only a few thousand men, not enough to resist the entire fleet. After a day of fighting, the UN troops captured the landing site and raised the victory flag. An American reporter present at the scene described, "This is a miniature Normandy, but with incredible precision." Immediately after capturing Incheon, MacArthur immediately ordered an attack on Seoul. For him, retaking the Korean capital was not only of strategic value, but also of great spiritual significance to the Allies. The Battle of Seoul lasted from September 22nd to 28th, 1950. The North Korean army resisted fiercely. Every house and every street turned into a battlefield. But with overwhelming superiority in firepower and air power, the UN forces gradually pushed back the enemy. On September 28th, the South Korean flag flew again over the Seoul government building. President Ri Sung-man returned to the capital, and the whole world saw this as a historic turning point. The victory at Incheon and Seoul completely reversed the situation. In less than a month, the North Korean army went from absolute initiative to retreat. Tens of thousands of soldiers were captured or killed, and supply lines were destroyed. In Washington, the Incheon campaign was hailed as one of the greatest campaigns in military history. MacArthur became a hero of the age, comparable to famous generals like Napoleon or Alexander. For the Korean people, the recapture of the capital brought new hope. But at the same time, this victory also opened up a big question. Should the United Nations stop at the 38th parallel to restore peace? After Seoul was liberated, many countries in the United Nations called for a truce to prevent the war from spreading further. However, President Truman and General MacArthur believed that this was a golden opportunity to end the war in complete victory. On October 1st, 1950, the South Korean army crossed the 38th parallel and entered the north. On October 7, the United Nations forces officially entered the war, despite warnings from China that they would not sit idly by if foreign troops approached the border. Throughout October, the United Nations forces advanced rapidly. Pyongyang, the capital of the North, fell on October 19, 1950. MacArthur confidently declared that the war would be over by Christmas, but behind these lightning victories, a storm was brewing. China, concerned about border security and the presence of the United States nearby, secretly prepared to intervene. Was the decision to cross the 38th parallel the right move? Or was it a mistake that would prolong the Korean War for another 3 years? The Korean War was not just a conflict between the north and south of the peninsula. From the beginning, it was linked to a broader international context. The confrontation between two major blocs, the United States and its Western allies, the Soviet Union and China in the Cold War system. By the end of 1950 and throughout 1951-1952, the battlefield was not only changed by guns, but also by fierce diplomatic chessboards. This was when the war entered the positional war phase, where military tactics were tested, improved, and the sides had to calculate every step. The most important event that changed the whole situation was the entry of China into the war in late 1950. When the UN forces under the command of General Douglas MacArthur pushed their attacks all the way to the banks of the Yalu River, the border with China, Beijing saw this as a direct threat to its national security. Mao Zedong decided to send the so-called Chinese People's Volunteer Army, PVA, into Korea. The first wave of the Vietnamese People's Army's attack took place in harsh weather conditions, using human wave tactics, surprise attacks at night, taking advantage of mountainous terrain to sneak deep into the enemy's rear. The US military military, which relied on superior firepower, artillery, and air power, much was surprised when faced with military tactics based on speed of movement, dispersion of small forces, and the ability to attack weak points in the logistics chain. As a result, the UN forces were forced to withdraw from the North Korean area, including the famous retreat at Chosin Reservoir. China's entry into the war transformed the war from a civil war to a large-scale international conflict. This was a strategic turning point that dragged on for many years. Disagreements within the US leadership became increasingly evident. General Douglas MacArthur, a Pacific hero, believed that the United States should expand the war, even excluding the use of nuclear weapons to contain China. He wanted to open a front against Beijing, bomb the Yalu Bridge, and bring in Kuomintang troops from Taiwan. In contrast, President Harry Truman feared that expanding the conflict would lead to World War III, especially with the direct involvement of the Soviet Union. This conflict led to the decision to fire MacArthur in April 1951, a political turning point in the United States, causing deep controversy in public opinion, but also showing the Truman administration's determination to limit the war to a local level, not spreading into a global war. After successive attacks and retreats in 1950-1951, the war entered a phase of localized warfare from mid-1951. At this time, the border gradually stabilized around the 38th parallel. The battles were mainly aimed at capturing high points and hills with observation advantages. North Korea and China took advantage of the tactics of digging trenches and fortifications, turning the battlefield into a solid defense network. The United Nations, especially the US, South Korea, and allied forces, applied military tactics based on firepower superiority. Heavy artillery, B-29 carpet bombing, combined with infantry attacks supported by tanks. Despite many fierce battles such as Broken Heart Hill, Blood Hill, Pig Rib Hill, the result was still a stalemate. Thousands of soldiers died and were wounded, but the border remained almost unchanged. Entering this stage, people realized that the Korean War was no longer just a matter of victory or defeat on the battlefield, but also depended greatly on diplomatic negotiations. Negotiations at Panmunjom, the intersection of politics and military from July 1951. The parties began negotiating an armistice at Panmunjom. However, this process took until 1953 to achieve results. The reasons were a series of thorny issues. The military demarcation line, should it remain along the 38th parallel or be based on the actual position of the occupying forces? Prisoner exchange. Tens of thousands of North Korean prisoners did not want to return, causing fierce debate. The role of the great powers. Although the Soviet Union did not directly participate in the war, it still had strong influence through China. The US was determined to protect South Korea as a front line against communism. While the negotiations dragged on, the battlefield was still raging. Battles on the bloody hills were often aimed at gaining an advantage at the negotiating table, but no longer had the ability to change the entire situation. Air and naval warfare, modern tactics in action. In addition to the land war, two other fronts also stand out. In the air, this was the first time in the history of air combat that jet aircraft faced off on a large scale. Soviet MiG-15s, flown by Soviet pilots but disguised as Chinese North Korean aircraft, faced off against American F-86 Sabres. The MiG Alley in the north of the peninsula became a symbol of early Cold War air combat. At sea, the US Navy and the United Nations controlled the sea, implementing a blockade and cutting off North Korea's supply lines. However, the strategic impact was limited because most of the aid from China came by land. These campaigns demonstrated a shift in military tactics in the 20th century, not just relying on numbers of troops, but also combining technological prowess, firepower, and the ability to control space. While the two sides were at odds, the Korean people suffered greatly. Cities such as Pyongyang and Seoul were destroyed one after another. Millions of civilians were killed or displaced. This was clear evidence that modern warfare was not limited to the battlefield, but extended to the entire society. The end of the period, deadlock with no way out. By the end of 1952, the situation was still deadlocked. The armies of both sides could barely advance, but neither wanted to make concessions at the negotiating table. Fatigue spread both on the battlefield and in the internal politics of the belligerent countries. In the United States, the 1952 presidential election brought Dwight Eisenhower to power with a promise to go to Korea and end the war. In China, the economic burden and casualties also made Beijing want to find a way out. The Soviet Union, after Stalin's death in 1953, also changed its attitude, willing to push for peace talks. All these factors paved the way for the 1953 armistice, but that's a story for the next part. If you've followed this far, you've probably seen that the Korean War was not just a series of bloody battles, but a complex geopolitical game where military tactics, diplomacy, and political will intertwined. In the next part, we'll delve into 1953, the crucial moment when the major powers had to sit down and make a choice between continuing the stalemate or seeking a ceasefire. By 1953, the Korean War had lasted more than 2.5 years. More than 1 million soldiers on both sides had died, and millions of civilians were dead or homeless. Yet the dividing line remained at the 38th parallel, right where it began. On the US and UN side, public support was waning. The war was increasingly seen as a war without end. Many US lawmakers questioned the Truman administration, and later the Eisenhower administration, about the human and financial costs of a conflict that was seen as far-fetched. And on the North Korean and Chinese sides, heavy logistical and economic burdens. China had to provide a huge amount of human and material aid while still rebuilding from the Civil War. On the Soviet Union, Stalin remained determined to maintain confrontation with the United States, but his death in March 1953 changed the balance, opening up new opportunities for diplomacy. In this context, 1953 became a decisive year. Would the war continue, or would the parties find a compromise? Soon after his election in late 1952, Dwight D. Eisenhower announced that he would personally visit the Korean Peninsula. This was not only a political move to fulfill a campaign promise, but also a strategic one. Eisenhower wanted to see the situation firsthand, to assess the possibility of a continuation of the war. He sent a strong message. The United States would not hesitate to increase pressure, even hinting at the possibility of using tactical nuclear weapons if the negotiations continued to stall. At the same time, he also left diplomatic channels open, showing that the United States was willing to seek peace if concessions were made. This visit boosted the morale of UN troops and put intense pressure on Beijing and Pyongyang. On March 5th, 1953, Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, died. This was a decisive event in the Korean War. Under Stalin, the Soviet Union appeared tough and determined not to give in, encouraging North Korea and China to continue to persevere. After Stalin's death, the new leadership in Moscow, especially Georgy Malenkov and later Nikita Khrushchev, wanted to ease tensions with the West and focus on internal stability. The Soviet Union began to urge China and North Korea to quickly reach an armistice. This was the diplomatic move that gave the peace process a real chance. The final battles struggle for power at the negotiating table, while the negotiations at Panmunjom continued. On the battlefield, both sides continued to engage in bloody fighting. The goal was no longer absolute victory, but to create a strategic advantage at the negotiating table. Pig Rib Hill. From April to July 1953, American and Chinese North Korean forces fought on this small but strategic hill. Win or lose, both sides suffered terrible casualties. Eventually, the hill was abandoned, but it became a symbol of the futility of the stalemate. Outpost Harry, Kumsong, many other positions also witnessed continuous attacks and retreats. These battles demonstrated military tactics were still applied fiercely, but the goal had shifted to serving diplomacy instead of changing the situation of the war. The POW issue, the biggest obstacle. Since 1951, the POW issue has become a key knot. The United Nations affirmed that POWs had the right to choose freely. Those who wanted to go to the north could go. Those who wanted to stay could stay. Tens of thousands of North Korean and Chinese soldiers refused to return home, causing confusion for the communist bloc. North Korea and China insisted on compulsory repatriation. This standoff lasted for 2 years. Finally, under international pressure, the parties accepted the solution of the Repatriation Committee of Neutral Countries, headed by India, to supervise the POWs. This was an important concession that paved the way for the agreement. After many rounds of negotiations, on July 27, 1953, the armistice agreement was signed at Panmunjom. Main provisions: complete cessation of hostilities on the peninsula. The military demarcation line was established roughly along the 38th parallel, along with a 4-kilometer wide demilitarized zone, DMZ, which still exists today. The international monitoring mechanism was carried out by the Neutral Nations Supervisory Commission, Sweden, Switzerland, Poland, Czechoslovakia. The The long-term political issue, Korean reunification, permanent peace, was expected to be discussed later, but in reality, it was never achieved. Notably, South Korea, under President Syngman Rhee, did not sign the agreement because he opposed the armistice, wanting to continue fighting to unify the peninsula. The agreement was signed only by representatives of the United Nations, North Korea, and China. The Korean War became a test bed for many Cold War tactics and strategies. Modern warfare relies on firepower, the decisive role of air power, artillery, and tanks in positional warfare. China's human wave tactics, effective in the early stages, but with heavy losses in the long run. Limited warfare. America learned that it could not go all out in every conflict, but had to consider the risk of nuclear escalation. Military diplomacy. The final battles proved that the battlefield and the negotiating table were inextricably linked, legacy lasting into the 21st century. Although an armistice was signed, true peace was never achieved. To this day, the two Koreas are still technically at war, with only a ceasefire. The demilitarized zone, DMZ, remains a symbol of tension, with thousands of soldiers facing each other. The war also left a profound lesson for the world, that modern warfare is not only decided by military tactics on the battlefield, but also by the balance between politics, diplomacy, and the will of the great powers. In 1953, the Korean War ended in an armistice, not peace. After more than 3 bloody years, the world realized the limits of local war in the nuclear age. Military tactics, no matter how fierce, eventually had to give way to negotiations. The Korean Peninsula remains divided to this day, a legacy of a war that never officially ended. You have just lived through 1953, a moment that shaped the entire future of the Korean Peninsula. In Part 6, we'll examine the war's lasting legacy in detail. From its impact on the global Cold War to its strategic lessons that remain relevant in the 21st century. On July 27, 1953, the shooting stopped, but the war never really ended. The Panmunjom Agreement was only an armistice, not a permanent peace. Since then, the Korean Peninsula has been living in a state of constant tension. What made this war such a heavy legacy that lasted for more than 7 decades? And why does the world still have to mention North Korea every time we talk about the threat of nuclear war? This is the opening question for Part 6, where we analyze the global consequences of the war, the Korean Peninsula, a scar that never heals, a division. The Armistice Agreement outlined the demilitarized zone, DMZ, 250 kilometer long and 4 kilometer wide, running along the 38th parallel. Rather than being a temporary boundary, this boundary became a permanent one. North Korea became a communist state led by Kim Il-sung, built a closed totalitarian regime. South Korea, initially an anti-communist dictatorship, then gradually democratized and became an economic powerhouse. Family, social, and cultural divisions still exist. Millions of people are stuck in 2 regions, unable to reunite with their loved ones. Now the demilitarized zone, DMZ'd, the most dangerous border in the world. The demilitarized zone, DMZ today, is where 2 armies face off with guns, tanks, and artillery. Every small move can cause a crisis. Can you imagine a country that has been in a temporary state of war for the past 70 years but never ended? Impact on the United States. The Korean War was the first time the United States engaged in a limited war in the nuclear era. Limits on military power. Despite possessing atomic bombs, the United States realized that it could not easily use nuclear weapons. The risk of global escalation forced Washington to accept war at a limited level. This was a lesson that shaped the entire US strategy in the Cold War. Military commitment in Asia. The United States maintained a long-term military presence in South Korea. The US-South Korea alliance became the pillar of regional security. From here, the US also began to build a system of military bases in Japan, Okinawa, Guam, and the Philippines. Korean Syndrome. The American public began to be skeptical about foreign wars. The question, is it worth it, appeared many times, from Korea to Vietnam later. China, stepping onto the world stage. Asserting the status of a great power, Mao Zedong's bold decision to join the Korean War. Despite heavy losses, estimated at over 180,000 dead, China proved to the world that it could take on the US. Socioeconomic consequences. The war left China's economy stagnant and resources scarce, but politically it consolidated Mao's power, laying the foundation for later policies, including the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. Sino-Soviet relations. The war was also the first major cooperation between the Soviet Union and China. But potential conflicts arose when the Soviet Union did not directly send troops, but only provided weapons and advisors. China felt it was shouldering a heavier burden. The Soviet Union supplied weapons, aircraft, and pilot training to North Korea and China. However, Stalin's death ushered in a new era. Moscow wanted to cool down the confrontation, leaving the burden to Beijing. This created the Sino-Soviet split later. The two sides cooperated in Korea, but the power struggle gradually led to confrontation. The Korean War inadvertently became an economic boost for Japan. The United States ordered a lot of weapons, equipment, and food from Japan. Japanese factories recovered quickly, laying the foundation for the economic miracle of the 1960s and 1970s. Thus, one of the biggest consequences. The Korean War helped Japan quickly transform from a defeated country into an industrial power. The formation of NATO, Seattle, the Korean War made the West realize the need for military alliances. NATO was strengthened in Europe, and in Asia, the US established Seattle Southeast Asia Treaty Organization to prevent communism. B. The arms race. After Korea, both the US and the Soviet Union accelerated the development of nuclear weapons and strategic bombers. The war proved that regional conflicts could escalate into global catastrophes. The Korean War was a huge laboratory for modern tactics. Mechanized warfare combined with air power, tanks, attack aircraft, helicopters were widely tested. Modern trench warfare, despite new weapons, ultimately reverted to the high point of defensive line artillery model of World War I. People's War. China adopted human wave tactics, relying on numbers and morale to compensate for weak firepower. Audience question: do these tactics still have value in the age of nuclear weapons and high technology? The Korean War is considered the first proxy war of the Cold War. From there, the US was determined to defend all anti-communist areas, leading to involvement in Vietnam. The Soviet Union and China expanded their influence into communist movements in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. The world was officially polarized into two opposing blocs. Without the Korean War, the Cold War probably would not have escalated so dramatically. Casualties: 2.5 to 3 million dead, mostly civilians. Refugees: millions fleeing their homeland, especially from north to south. Prisoners and families separated. To this day, there are brief reunions, then separations again. The war divided not only the territory, but also the hearts and memories of the Korean people. Today, North Korea remains a totalitarian regime in the north, developing nuclear weapons to protect its power, a growing democracy in the south, becoming an economic and technological powerhouse. The world's most militarized border, the 1950-53 war left a peninsula frozen in history, beyond reconciliation. Can the two Koreas be unified in the 21st century? Will North Korea give up its nuclear weapons? Can the United States, China, and Russia work together to bring about real peace? These are questions no one can answer with certainty. But one thing is certain: every decision today is influenced by the war more than 70 years ago. The Korean War was not just a regional conflict, but a global turning point. It divided the peninsula forever, reshaped the strategies of the United States, China, and the Soviet Union, pushed the world into an era of all-out confrontation. Its legacy lives on today, in every gun fired in the demilitarized zone, DMZ, in every speech by North Korean leaders, and in every US-South Korean military exercise. When it comes to the 20th century, many people immediately think of World War II on a global scale, or the Vietnam War with its shocking images on television. But the Korean War, 1950-1953, is often forgotten. Despite its terrible casualties, more than 3 million people died. In the US, it is called the Forgotten War, not because it is not important, but because it ended with a vague armistice without a clear victory. The media at that time was not modern, so people did not witness vivid images like in Vietnam. In the minds of many people, Korea is just a strange land, not as large as Europe. But in fact, the Korean War left a deep mark on the global security structure, in the memory of the Korean people, and in the awareness of all humanity. Memory in North Korea, from pain to strength, the early post-war years. The South was devastated, Seoul was repeatedly destroyed, infrastructure was exhausted, and millions of people were reduced to poverty. South Korean society had to deal with memories of family separation and loss of loved ones. B. Memory transformed into motivation. Over the decades, memories of war became the basis for national unity. The South Korean government skillfully used war imagery to evoke anti-communist sentiment while promoting modernization. The Miracle on the Han River, 1960-1980, was inseparable from the obsession of not letting the country collapse again. The post-war generation saw it as their responsibility to build a strong nation to avoid a repeat of the tragedy. See today's memories. Although South Korea has become one of the world's top 10 economies, the scars of war remain. War museums attract millions of visitors each year. Family reunions between the North and the South, while rare, remind society that the past is not over. Audience question: can a country truly heal when the wounds are still being carved deep into the DMZ? Memory in North Korea, a political tool. A. History as Pyongyang tells it. In North Korea, the war is not forgotten, but is deeply ingrained in propaganda. Leader Kim Il-sung is hailed as the hero who resisted Americanization of the country. The US and South Korea are portrayed as barbaric invaders who caused all kinds of pain. Museums, monuments, and films all emphasize the image of North Korea and China's victory over American imperialism. B. Memory nourishes current policy. The Pyongyang regime uses the memory of the war to justify comprehensive militarization, development of nuclear weapons, strict social control. For North Koreans, the memory of the war is not just history, but also the regime's raison d'etre. Memory in America, a fading scar, a public attitudes. When American soldiers returned from Korea, they were not greeted as heroes of World War II. Many did not even know what America had fought for. The war ended without victory. The American media at the time paid little attention, leaving the public unable to clearly imagine its scale, making Korea an obscure war in the collective memory. B. Lasting impact. Despite being forgotten in the public memory, the Korean War left a strategic legacy. The US accepted a long-term military commitment in Asia. Korean veterans later had a strong influence on US politics and the military. The experience in Korea became a wake-up call before the US got bogged down in Vietnam. Memories in China, resist America, aid Korea, the glory of sacrifice. In Chinese history, the Korean War is called Resist America, Aid Korea. It became a symbol of the spirit of sacrifice. An impoverished country, just emerging from civil war, dared to confront the American superpower. B. Propaganda tradition. Literary works, films, and musicals about the war are still produced to this day. The soldiers of the People's Volunteer Army are praised as legends. See? Current political significance for China today, this memory is used to reaffirm the position of regional peacekeeper. Recall the blood relationship with North Korea, although in reality, the relationship between the two sides is no longer as warm as before. The forgotten war in global memory. In Europe, Africa, or South America, the Korean War is rarely mentioned. It is overshadowed by other conflicts, by the complexity of distant geopolitics. However, for international researchers, this was the first proxy war of the Cold War, paving the way for a series of conflicts later. Therefore, in the academic world, the memory of Korea is never forgotten. Humanitarian significance. Memories of civilians. A. The pain of civilians. More than 2 million civilians died from bombs, shelling, and famine. Both sides witnessed the tragedy of villages being wiped out. Many families still retain memories of the terrible chaos of 1950 when the North Vietnamese army invaded. B. Separated families. The most painful memories are those of families being divided in two. To this day, many elderly people in the South have never met their children and grandchildren in the North. C. Refugees in the world. Hundreds of thousands of North Korean refugees have fled to the United States, Japan, and Europe. In their memories, the Korean War is not forgotten, but a lifelong obsession. Memory in culture and art. American cinema, many films reflect the brutality, but are less famous than films about Vietnam. Korean literature. Many novels depict scenes of division, especially in literature after 1980. Contemporary music and art. In Korea, artists use memories of war to talk about peace and unification. So although the Korean War is forgotten in international politics, it is still alive in the cultures of the peoples involved. Historical significance. Lessons for humanity, a limited war in the nuclear age. North Korea demonstrated that superpowers cannot easily use nuclear weapons. And this is a lesson that should keep the world on guard in any future conflict. B. Lasting division. The war created one of the most tense borders on the planet. This is a classic example of the consequences of ideological division. C. History repeats. The lesson of North Korea has echoed in many subsequent wars: Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq. The world has realized a war that is not thoroughly resolved can have consequences for decades. Memory and the present. 21st century North Korea today. Every time North Korea tests a missile or makes a nuclear threat, the memory of the 1950-53 war resurfaces. New generations may not have experienced it firsthand, but the fear is still transmitted through collective memory. Can the memory of war be a bridge of reconciliation, or is it just a political weapon to divide? 11. Why must we not forget? Because millions of lives were lost. Because the strategic lessons are still valuable. Because peace today is always fragile if the past is forgotten. The Korean War is a forgotten war for some countries, but for the Korean people and those concerned about global security, it must never be forgotten. The Korean War is a scar on human memory, forgotten in the eyes of some, but still alive in the hearts of those who suffered. This reminds us that peace is never eternal. One mistake, and the world could fall into a similar spiral as in 1950. You have just reviewed with me the memory and historical significance of the Korean War, a forgotten war that shaped the entire 20th century. In Part 8, we will look at peace efforts, diplomacy, and future prospects for reunification of the Korean Peninsula. The armistice signed on July 27, 1953, formally ended 3 years of bloody fighting on the Korean Peninsula. However, what is often misunderstood is that it was not a comprehensive peace treaty, but simply a temporary ceasefire. That is, legally, the two Koreas and the international belligerents more broadly never actually ended the war. Since then, a state of not war but not peace has dominated the peninsula for more than 7 decades. In the immediate aftermath of 1953, the Korean Peninsula became one of the hottest spots of the Cold War. In the north, the Kim Il-sung regime consolidated power, built a centralized government, and accelerated industrialization on the Soviet model. Meanwhile, the south, under Syngman Rhee and successive administrations, was closely tied to the United States and its Western allies. The division was not only political and military, but also deeply rooted in every aspect of society, culture, and the psychology of the people of the two regions. The question is, when the war has ended, why has true peace not been achieved? The answer lies in the lack of absolute trust between the parties, along with international strategic calculations. Peace in a stalemate. From the 1950s to the 1970s, the military demarcation line along the 38th parallel, today the demilitarized zone, DMZ, became one of the most heavily militarized areas in the world. Both sides deployed hundreds of thousands of soldiers, underground tunnels, checkpoints, and barbed wire fences stretching for hundreds of kilometers. Any mistake, no matter how small, could lead to a new outbreak of conflict. Sporadic clashes, covert incursions, and even attempted assassinations were common, creating a tense atmosphere. Meanwhile, on the international chessboard, North Korea received strong support from the Soviet Union and China. In contrast, South Korea became an important anti-communist outpost for the United States and Asia. The two Koreas were like two chess pieces representing two opposing global blocs, and any changes on the peninsula were tied to the larger strategies of the great powers. Could a comprehensive peace treaty be reached in such a context? Obviously, it would be very difficult, because if peace were to be recognized, it would mean recognizing the existence of two independent Korean states, something neither Pyongyang nor Seoul had wanted to accept for decades. Half-hearted diplomacy. Since the late 1970s, some diplomatic efforts have been made to ease tensions. In 1972, the North-South Joint Declaration was issued, pledging to seek peaceful reunification, but tensions quickly escalated as North Korea engaged in espionage, and South Korea continued to hold joint military exercises with the United States. In the 1990s, as the Soviet Union collapsed and the Cold War ended, there were hopes that the Korean Peninsula would move closer to reconciliation. Now, South Korean President Kim Dae-jung, with his famous Sunshine Policy, pushed for inter-Korean meetings, opened railways, roads, and economic cooperation at the Kaesong Industrial Complex. Images of the two leaders shaking hands once shook the world, but then the North Korean nuclear issue resurfaced, overshadowing all diplomatic efforts. A rhetorical question was posed to the audience. Can there be true peace if one side continues to develop nuclear weapons while the other relies on the US nuclear umbrella? This is the biggest paradox of the Korean Peninsula, and also the reason why all comprehensive peace treaties have failed. Conflict in the hearts of the people. The war has not only stopped at the political aspect, but has also left deep wounds in the hearts of millions of people. Many families separated since 1953 have not had the opportunity to reunite. The brief meetings organized by the two governments, often lasting only a few days, are not enough to heal the pain of separation that lasts a lifetime. Images of elderly people crying in the arms of their loved ones after decades of separation are proof of the heavy humanitarian consequences of the war. In South Korea, today's young generation may consider the Korean War a distant part of history, but in North Korea, the war is reenacted every day as a vivid memory, a reminder of the threat from the South and the US. It is this difference that has created a huge gap in social awareness, making the prospect of reconciliation even more difficult. Looking at the whole picture, we can clearly see that the Korean Peninsula is still stuck in a vicious cycle. Truce, tension, dialogue, then tension again. So the big question for each of us is, does this generation or the next generation have enough courage and wisdom to break that historical spiral? Put yourself in the shoes of the North Korean people, who have not experienced a single day of real peace since 1950. What would you choose? Continued armed confrontation or risk the chance of unification? If you want to learn more about the diplomatic moves, nuclear crisis, and unification efforts in the coming decades, keep reading. Don't forget to leave your comments. What do you think can bring lasting peace to the Korean Peninsula? If in the early post-military period, tensions mainly revolved around sporadic armed conflicts and opposing propaganda, then since the end of the 20th century, the nuclear issue has become the focus of the world's concern on the Korean Peninsula. The first nuclear crisis. In the early 1990s, when the Soviet Union collapsed, North Korea fell into an extremely difficult situation. Economic crisis, aid from Moscow dried up, severe famine threatened millions of lives. In that context, Pyongyang chose the path of developing nuclear weapons as a survival shield. In 1994, the world was shocked when the US and North Korea almost went to war because of suspicions that the Yongbyon reactor was being used for military purposes. Former US President Jimmy Carter had to go directly to Pyongyang to negotiate, paving the way for the agreed framework. Accordingly, North Korea agreed to freeze its nuclear program in exchange for energy aid and light water reactors. However, this agreement soon collapsed in the early 2000s due to a lack of mutual trust. The question is, does using nuclear weapons as a bargaining chip help North Korea secure its security? Or does it only make it more isolated internationally? The Sunshine Policy and short-lived hope. Meanwhile, in South Korea, President Kim Dae-jung initiated the Sunshine Policy in the late 1990s. This was a rare attempt to open up, engage in economic cooperation, and exchange humanitarian aid with North Korea. The historic summit between Kim Dae-jung and Kim Jong-il in 2000 shocked the world. Kim Dae-jung even won the Nobel Peace Prize for this policy. The Kaesong Industrial Complex was established, where South Korean companies employed North Korean workers as a symbol of cross-border cooperation. Family reunions were held periodically. Many believed this could be the start of a genuine reconciliation process. However, the glimmer of hope was too fragile. Just a few years later, North Korea announced its withdrawal from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT, and conducted its first nuclear test in 2006. Hopes for unification were quickly replaced by fears of a new military crisis. Six-party talks. In response, the international community launched the six-party talks, which included North Korea, South Korea, the United States, China, Japan, and Russia. The goal was to find a comprehensive solution to the nuclear and regional security issues. At times, there seemed to be progress, such as when Pyongyang agreed to shut down Yongbyon in exchange for oil aid and sanctions relief. However, in a vicious cycle, agreements repeatedly collapsed due to differences in terms and a lack of transparency. North Korea continued to test nuclear weapons in 2009. 2013 and later, further eroding trust between the parties. Rhetorical question for the audience. Can a lasting agreement be reached when each side pursues its own strategic interests, rather than putting peace first? The role of the great powers. In this panorama, the role of the great powers cannot be ignored. The United States regards South Korea as a strategic ally, maintaining about 28,000 troops on the peninsula to deter North Korea. On the other hand, China sees North Korea as an important buffer against Western influence. Russia wants to assert its position in Northeast Asia, while Japan is directly concerned about the missile threat from Pyongyang. The Korean Peninsula is therefore not only an internal issue of two regions, but also a strategic chessboard where great powers compete for influence. Peace here is therefore even more complicated. It cannot be achieved by bilateral dialogue alone, but requires international consensus, which is extremely difficult, shuttle diplomacy, and historic moments. The 2010s witnessed many unprecedented diplomatic moments. In 2018, the two leaders of the two Koreas, Kim Jong-un and Moon Jae-in, met at the truce village of Panmunjom, held hands, and walked across the military demarcation line. The image brought millions of people to tears, as if peace was just around the corner. That same year, Kim Jong-un also met face-to-face with US President Donald Trump in Singapore, marking the first time a North Korean leader had held talks with a sitting US president. The handshakes and declarations of goodwill were hailed as a historic turning point. However, the actual results were modest. Negotiations quickly fell into a stalemate as Pyongyang wanted sanctions relief first, while Washington demanded denuclearization first. Once again, hopes for peace were dashed. Looking back, we see a vicious cycle repeating itself. Tension, dialogue, hope, then disappointment. How many times have seemingly historic handshakes vanished in a mist of doubt? How many times have people on both sides prepared for a future of reconciliation only to see the border sealed even tighter? Are we witnessing an eternal war? No gunfire, but no peace. Just endless cycles. In the next section, we will take a deeper look at the social, economic, and psychological consequences of no war, no peace for the people of both Koreas, as well as discuss the prospect of unification. Is it a dream that can become a reality, or will it remain an illusion forever, although the guns fell silent in 1953? For the people of North Korea, on both sides, the war never really ended. In fact, the scars are still felt in everyday life, leaving profound consequences for society, psychology, and national identity. In North Korea, society is constantly militarized. From a young age, children are taught about the threat from the South and the United States, about the spirit of sacrifice for the fatherland. Grand parades, monuments, slogans, all emphasize the message that the country is always surrounded and only absolute loyalty can ensure survival. The lives of tens of millions of people therefore revolve around the concept of enemy rather than a common future. In contrast, in South Korea, despite its remarkable economic development, the specter of war still weighs heavily. The people of Seoul live right under the range of North Korean artillery, just a few dozen kilometers from the border. They regularly participate in air defense drills, hear sirens, and have to accept the fact that their peace is always fragile. A modern society, but still full of insecurity. The question is, can a normal society be built when the mind is constantly haunted by the risk of sudden conflict? Economic impact. One side develops, the other retreats. The separation has caused the two sides to develop in two completely opposite directions. South Korea, thanks to global economic integration, has become one of the Asian dragons, with globally famous technology, automobile, and electronics corporations. North Korea, by contrast, is almost isolated from the international trading system. Sanctions, poor management, and military priorities have devastated the economy. The most obvious consequence was the famine of the 1990s, which claimed the lives of hundreds of thousands, even millions. The Kaesong industrial complex was once seen as an economic bridge between the two Koreas. But as relations soured again, the area was closed, leaving behind a bitter lesson that any economic cooperation on the peninsula is as fragile as the current political situation. The rhetorical question, can the two Koreas coexist for long with such a huge development gap? One side is Asia's leading economy, the other is constantly on the brink of crisis, separated families, and unsolved humanitarian tragedy. One of the most painful wounds of the war was the separation of families. Millions were stranded on both sides of the border in 1953, many never to see their loved ones again. Red Cross reunions were sporadic, with only a few hundred people meeting for a few short days, then being separated again. The image of grandparents in their 80s and 90s crying when they recognized their younger brothers and sisters after half a century moved the world. But more heartbreakingly, most of them passed away without having the chance to reunite. This is not just the story of a few families, but the common tragedy of an entire nation. A heartbreaking question arises: how many more generations will have to live and die without being able to hug their loved ones just because of a political boundary? People from both sides, although educated in two completely opposite ideologies, still share a common identity. They speak the same Korean language, share the same cultural traditions, and carry within them the same 1,000-year-old historical memories. This creates a paradox. Deep down, many people still yearn for unification, but in reality, the gap is deepening. In the North, unification is promoted as liberating the South. In the South, unification was sometimes seen as a huge burden, with the cost of rebuilding the North possibly exceeding that of Germany after 1990. So the dream of unification never disappeared, but it was never really close either. It was like a lamp, sometimes burning brightly in diplomatic moments, sometimes flickering in political storms, delayed peace, or suspended conflict. The current situation on the Korean Peninsula is what many scholars call a delayed peace. There is no formal peace treaty, only an armistice. There is no full-scale war, but the threat of military conflict is ever present. This creates a state of uncertainty, both stable and extremely fragile. Even a small incident, a shell, a missile test, a miscalculation, could spark conflict. And then, with the current nuclear arsenal, the consequences are unpredictable. The question for you, are we living in peace? Or is this just a brief lull before the next storm? When we look at the Korean Peninsula, we see more than a geopolitical conflict. Behind the numbers, the missiles, and the treaties, there are the fates of millions of people. Fathers, mothers, children who will live their entire lives separated. Do you believe that one day, the steel walls, minefields, and barbed wire fences will disappear, replaced by bridges connecting the two sides? And do you think that for that to happen, the most important thing is not weapons or treaties, but the faith and courage of people? The idea of Korean reunification has long been a shared aspiration on both sides. But when we look deeper, we see many different scenarios, each with its own advantages and disadvantages. The northern model of unification is dominant. This is the scenario promoted in Pyongyang, liberating the South, reunifying the country under the leadership of the North Korean government. But in reality, this possibility is almost impossible due to the differences in economic and technological power, and especially the US military presence in South Korea. The southern model of unification is dominant like Germany. After 1990, South Korea has annexed the North, making it part of a market democracy. This is a vision that many Southerners want, but it raises the question, how much will reconstruction cost? It is estimated that modernizing the infrastructure and bringing the North closer to the South could cost trillions of dollars. Federation or two-system community. Some scholars have proposed a federal model, two regions that maintain their own political systems but have a symbolic federal government. This could be a compromise solution, easing initial tensions. However, ideological differences are too great for this model to easily fall into a deadlock. Gradual unification through economic and social cooperation. This is the most realistic scenario. Start with joint industrial zones, like Kaesong, expand cultural and educational exchanges, and gradually create closeness. When trust is strong enough, politics can move towards unification. The rhetorical question is, can a country go from hatred to unification only through cooperation, step by step, but sustainably? Barriers to unification. Unification is not just a matter of will, but also faces many barriers. Political, ideological. The gap between totalitarianism and democracy is almost irreconcilable. Economic. The huge development gap will create a huge burden. South Korea, even though rich, must consider this price. Military. North Korea possesses nuclear weapons. Any step towards unification must address the issue of nuclear security. Geopolitical. China, Russia, the United States, Japan all have their own interests. A unified Korea could change the balance of power in Northeast Asia, and not all the major powers are willing to accept that. It is these barriers that make the prospect of unification, however desirable, still distant. Role of the major powers. It is impossible to talk about unification without mentioning the role of the major powers. United States wants to ensure security for South Korea, while not allowing North Korea to become a nuclear threat. Washington could support unification, but only if it did not undermine America's military position in Asia. China fears that a collapse of Pyongyang would create a massive refugee crisis, and fears that a unified Korea tilted more heavily toward the US would deprive Beijing of a strategic buffer zone. Russia, less influential but still keen to maintain a presence in Northeast Asia, not allowing itself to be left behind. Japan benefits from a stable peninsula, but also fears that a powerful unified Korea would become a regional competitor. So unification is not just up to the Koreans, but also a chessboard of superpowers. Many people often compare North Korea to East and West Germany, but this lesson cannot be fully applied. Germany reunified after the collapse of the Soviet Union in the context of the end of the Cold War. For North Korea, the current international situation does not present a similar window of opportunity. Although East Germany's economy was worse, it was still average, not as far apart as North and South Korea. East and West Germany still maintained more cultural and social ties than the two Koreas, which were almost completely severed. However, the most important lesson from Germany is that unification only comes when one side is willing to make fundamental changes, and when the international situation is favorable. What will the future of the Korean Peninsula look like? Since 1953, there have been many flashes of hope: inter-Korean summits, pledges to denuclearize, historic handshakes. But then, most have fallen into stalemate. However, there is no denying that the trend for peace and cooperation still exists. People on both sides, especially the younger generation, increasingly want a future no longer haunted by war. Perhaps unification will not come overnight, but will be a long-term process, from economic cooperation to social exchange to political reform. And the ultimate question is, will future generations have the patience, faith, and courage to make that dream come true? The Korean War ended more than 70 years ago, but its wounds have not yet healed. The Korean Peninsula remains divided, and the world is still watching. What do you think? In the 21st century, could we see a unified Korea without minefields and barbed wire, but instead with high-speed trains connecting Seoul and Pyongyang? If that dream comes true, it would not only be a victory for a nation, but also a testament to the fact that even the deepest wounds of history can be healed. If you enjoy analysis videos like this, please support me with a like and subscribe.